All right, we're here. Welcome to another episode. We're on 28, I think we said, Brian. 27,
28.
28. Wow, we're getting there. Trying to get this whole once a week thing jiving and flowing here.
Exactly. It'll make that number go up faster, right?
It'll do something for us, right?
Triple digits soon. I could see it
Yeah,
on the
I know, right?
horizon.
I'm
So
down
it's
with that,
always good when
baby.
we have a guest joining us. So I don't know, Brian, you want to do an introduction for our friend David here, and we'll kind of dive right in.
Definitely. So we have David Bevett here today. He's the manager in security governance is his focus. And so just excited to have you here with us today, David. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Right on. So I think we had a couple stories. We can kind of start with those, and then obviously we'll dive into a few topics. Dave, I think, had a couple things we can walk through. One of the interesting stories. It's almost like a continuation of what we've seen as a theme almost. So more crackdowns in Russia area, right? Of dark web type websites, illicit access, access brokers and things like that. So it looks like there was, several more taken down. Details are still kind of coming out, but we're kind of seeing this trend now, right? Where we were talking about this last time about, you know, kind of going after their own backyard, so to speak, and how much are they really going to kind of go after? But it does seem like they are, being they, I mean Russia in this standpoint is kind of really kind of cracking down on people within their own kind of backyard. So I think overall it's a pretty good thing for the industry and kind of what we're seeing. So, but it still is that whole whack-a-mole type concept. I think unfortunately, right? One goes down and three or four more pop up. But it's an interesting trend that I was kind of surprised to see, to be honest, from my perspective.
Well, and then this group goes after some low value things like credit cards, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
So go for the low hanging fruit, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
carding forms, I think.
right. I'm always like, when I read these stories, I'm always, trying to figure out if it's really a PR move, or are we really doing cleanup here, right? It's they've had such inconsistent track record of just of their reputation in the cyber world in general, I guess. So when you see something like this, it makes you wonder what different internal organizations are contending amongst one another to
To me,
clean things
part of
up,
it,
or I guess clean up the image.
100%. Well, I think some of that really comes down to legitimacy, right? So a government that doesn't have the ability to enforce law amongst its own people stands in a different kind of jeopardy, right? So I think in some ways it's really about being able to show that you have control and influence over your population, right? You may be hacking other governments, but the question is whether or not you have control over the individuals that are hacking and whether or not you actually have mastery over them.
That's a
That's a
good
great
point,
point.
right? Yeah, I think Sammy, to what you're saying, it's like these are more the maybe I want to say low level workers, right? But some of the more credit cards and more I don't want to devalue this basic type stuff out there, right? But I think to your point, David, what you're saying is if you can't kind of control the narrative almost a little bit, right? You're kind of wanting to keep people somewhat aligned and kind of like in check for the more sophisticated kind of cyber attacks that we often see out there and things like that. So yeah, it's a continuing interesting story for sure. Brian, you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, no, it definitely is from that aspect, right? So I think they always will throw up the lowest end people for this, right? So that's kind of like we continue to see that. I think we saw that in some of those other arrests that occurred, that it was the lower end people that they put in. But I think they continue to help sacrifice. I mean, when you look at the larger international security pieces that are going on right now with the Ukraine and all of that, it's like another way to try to help diffuse it and say, well, look, we're doing stuff.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. So I think that's kind of the model that we see here.
This don't look over here, look over here type of a thing, right?
Exactly. And if I distract you over here, then you don't notice this thing over here.
Right.
Absolutely. Right. You can't be, if you're going to have legitimacy, especially in today's international atmosphere, right, you've got to be able to show that you have an appropriate level of controls, right, versus being, dynamically out of control, because then you can't even have some of the partners that are stretching across to include, right, China, right, where there's a conversation with Russia, right, where there's other countries out there that need to look at them with some sense of legitimacy. And if it's all chaos and it's all havoc, then how can they ultimately be an authoritative power?
Exactly. It's kind of hard to do business with somebody that doesn't have their ducks in a row, particularly if they have multiple factions operating with different agendas, at a pretty critical level, I'd say, with the political climate. So every move like this helps cast a light that on Russia, that they're still in control of all of the different actors within their borders. But whether that's true or not is tough to say. And obviously, without knowing the internal comms, you really don't know what the true intent is. But it's always a story when you're dealing with these types of events from that side of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So another thought is do they just go take a picture with handcuffs on them and then take the handcuffs off and let them go back? I mean, what are they really doing with these people? Do they go to a trial? Do they get sent somewhere else? Like, they don't have extradition agreements with the US, to my knowledge. So yeah.
True.
Well, it comes back to the whole video we saw, like it was like a couple weeks ago with, the quote unquote gangs were getting seized and attacked. And it was just this really, I don't know, it's just strange video, right? It was just like, is it real? Is it not real? Like, I don't know. It was a very odd just flow to it. And I think to your point, Brian, it's like, is this really like for show, so to speak? Or to your point, like, hey, yeah, we did something and then stay here for a couple of weeks and kind of, go off and do something else and just like lay low for a little bit, right? So,
well, in the States, if they're good enough, we just hire them. That's what we do. We just recruit them onto our force. So maybe that's what they're doing. This is a part of the recruitment strategy. Hopefully,
the ultimate job interview, Sammy.
Yeah, 100%. They got caught, but
sacrifice.
Well, it brings up a quote that I don't think I thought about it for a long time, but long ago in the college days when I was pledging, there was a guy, Carter G. Woodson, and the statement was, or the quote was, "If you can control a man's thoughts, you don't have to worry about his actions."
There you go.
That's very powerful. Very powerful.
Very true words to live by.
Yeah.
Very good. So I think another one, kind of changing gears, a topic that comes up on the show a lot from a security perspective. This one was all over the news this morning, so I'm sure it's mainstream by now. But a couple was arrested from the DOJ in New York for allegedly trying to launder about $4.5 billion in cryptocurrency. A favorite topic of ours here, right? Crypto and kind of cybersecurity all rolled into one. Yeah, very, very interesting story. Like when you kind of see these people's personalities and this and that, and it was a very kind of bizarre thing, to be honest, watching a little articles and reading through it. So I don't know, Sammy, you're pretty big on this side of it. What are your kind of thoughts on that one?
Well, it's certainly bold and brazen of the two actors, as they were pretty, I guess, flat. They're pretty flowery with their spending. And it seemed like they rang a lot of bells, and they for people that were involved in such a massive hack, you would think that they'd have a little bit more discretion when they were trying to launder the
I didn't watch enough TV shows and Ozarks to lay low and
right. Yeah,
they didn't do low key.
I don't think they took notes in season 2. It's obvious.
They didn't get the car wash and laundry the money the right way.
Yeah, no, they definitely skipped that season or something. But it just shows that there's more to it than the hack itself, and it seems like they may have been just associated with people who were involved in the hack. I just find it difficult to believe that the same people who could pull something like this off would not exercise some amount of caution when trying to wash it, essentially. So, but it's not completely uncommon because they're working in teams, and if they're one part of a larger team, perhaps they're not the sharpest tool in the shed. but it makes for a good story.
That's true.
$5 million bond. That's hopefully they have that sitting around in altcoins.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess they forgot that box that's now on the 1040 form for the IRS that says, "Do you own cryptocurrency? Yes or no?" Guess they should have checked the box. So I mean, to me, it also brings up something else. Like, isn't this supposed to be anonymous? So how do they track them down?
Fair.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that was an interesting perspective on that. How do they track them down? Is it truly anonymous, and was it through the transactions? What really brought it to light? And the last thing I'll say about that, before, it kind of reminded me when I saw the videos, which were kind of borderline. I don't know that I'd watch them on MTV if it was still around. In the way that it used to be, but it's like they need to be more Jay-Z, right? Where you can kind of talk about what you did and the life that you were in, but you actually also have to be slick enough not to be caught up in jail over what it is that you're communicating. And that's the difference between folks that, will kind of come to the underbelly and then came to the top side versus folks that just don't get it.
Yeah, they're a little bit too showy with it, right? It's kind of more like you don't want to like self-incriminate yourself in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's also many layers to it from this. If you think about it from the perspective of the people who initiated the hack and stole the funds, they could have distributed part of the funds to people to basically obfuscate their own identity. I know that if I had performed something like that, I would definitely want to distract and divert any law enforcement that was coming after me, and I think that would be. I mean, they already have a malicious intent. If you, with the right personality, and someone offers you that kind of money, it's not unreasonable to think that these are just being used. These people are being used as scapegoats for a larger faction. That's my tinfoil hat thinking here. But alternatively, they just were, pretty flagrant about their spending. They bought items that were easily trackable. The transactions histories, the Coinbase has to share transaction history with the US government. Like, when they say anonymous, the ledger is anonymous. You don't know who necessarily owns a particular address by name if they're smart enough to hide that, but they still share that with the US government, and if law enforcement has access to that data, they can then find the discrepancies in spending and between income and essentially catch them. There's not enough details as to in the story as to which agency and how. But or what did they say it was the DOJ? Bitfinex. Yeah, so DOJ. So it says right there, Bitfinex was working with them. So clearly that the exchanges. I believe in order with the way regulation is going now, they're required to comply with U.S. governments in these types of scenarios. There's only a small list that don't, and I don't think they're U.S. based or can operate legally in the U.S. So yeah, I think this just goes to show that if you are going to be you're going to be in cryptocurrency as a criminal, you probably want to go with a more anonymous coin on more anonymous exchanges. It sounds like if they were doing their transactions on Bitfinex, that was their issue. You know what I mean? That's a rather public platform.
Yeah, so actually this brings up a good topic, right? So like I kind of want to go back to what you were saying, Brian, about the like anonymity, right? In my opinion, I think, Sam, you're right. Parts of the crypto community is anonymous, and the addresses, like you can't really map up, a key to a person per se. I mean, I'm sure there's ways you could do it, but at the end of the day, like, is this actually more traceable than like real money at the end of it, right? Because you still have that kind of digital stamp, if you will, and it's, as we all know, there's like, you can never delete anything from the internet, right? It's just not possible. So there's always going to be some paper trail or log trail or, insert whatever trail. So does this make it actually harder to siphon and launder and do, illicit things with crypto compared to like real paper money or fiat money, right? So
yeah, it just creates these like central points of failure where it's like, if from an anonymity perspective, in theory it should be more anonymous, but the exchanges themselves have a lot of view into what is going on, especially if the accounts are linked to legitimate people. So In those cases, in theory, it could be less anonymous, given those exchanges happily work with U.S. governments and the IRS and whatnot. Now, if you had worked, if you're using some shady coin and some decentralized exchange, often who knows God what country, then you might have a better time remaining anonymous, because they're not going to be as willing to comply. But again, it's just a matter of finding these intermediaries for the exchange. But again, they were buying items that would typically get flagged as well.
Oh yeah.
So it wasn't like they were being
Any
too
kind of flashy car, watch, jewelry, purse. I mean, that's just like, well, where did this come from, right? It's like the worst thing you could do.
Derek's never had the FBI knock on his door.
They just circle my house. It's cool.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Nice.
They're waiting out back with the black van. Actually, they're just waiting for the podcast to be done. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah. So a lot of these, like, you started this year with those microtransactions with the Venmos and the Zells or whatever of the world. Actually, Zelle says they're not required to report, I guess. That the banks are actually the ones that have to do it there. But Venmo and all these other, PayPal, anything over $600, they're starting to report. And then I know that the exchanges have to start reporting for next year. So this year's, 2022's taxes. So for next year, they'll get reported in. So like right now, it's the honor system, and there's that checkbox, yes or no. So it's considered fraud if you don't do the right answer on it. And so the way that the current laws are set up are for that. So it'll be interesting to see how this changes the crypto world moving forward.
Absolutely. And one of the things that it brings to mind is, for those of us that are especially on the security side of the equation, no matter how deep you are behind the veil, this really ushers in the question of what kind of presence and reality should Big Brother have, right? Mm-hmm. In our spending, in the things that we do, in our travel, right? We've got everything from COVID identification now, right? What's your vaccination number? Now we're getting everything that's traceable. And from a security perspective, that's really what we want. But how does that really jive with the concept of freedom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very hot topic for people, like the privacy versus like the, what's the right word, right? Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Convenience. Yeah, right. So they all kind of like, it's like almost this opposite balance thing, right? I mean, then on one spectrum, we have people that will just consent and check every box to something like a Facebook or Meta and be like, yeah, sure, track whatever, and just have at it. And some people are like, well, wait a minute, this is getting a little too close to home. And is it kind of a recurring thing we have, David? I think you're spot on with that. The principle of like technology being cool and, trendy and like, life changing, but at like what cost do you give it up? Right. So
100%.
Social scores, vaccine, like it's a whole can of worms that opens up for sure.
Yeah. I mean, Gmail was probably one of the first ones that was like this, where they mined your email to get free email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You wanted to be cool and have that first at gmail.com. It was like, well, okay, sure. Consent to these T's and C's that jokingly nobody ever reads. Right. So
yeah, and you had to beg for an invite.
Yeah, I remember that.
And one of the issues is everybody has a different capacity. They have a different tolerance for how much data they're willing to give up, and many people don't even know what the ramifications of them giving up that data is. So they're like, "Oh, well, I'm not doing anything bad. It doesn't affect me." But it's like that's not the point. You know what I mean? What if people start using this data to build use cases against you in a malicious way?
Exactly.
And so without getting too political, it's something that I think like a lot of legislators miss on is what exactly it means and how this could be used by large organizations to really hurt the constituents and the their customers. And so I think it's tough because a lot of it just comes down to education. You have to really read through what the rights are given away when you're installing anything or using a site. What cookies are you giving away? And also to your point is what data is publicly available like my vaccine card number. Like, I mean, I think most people would be bewildered if they, had an OSINT engagement run against them and they figured out how bad their OPSEC was. I mean, some of this information is literally available on public websites.
Yep.
So it's certainly a discussion that needs to be more in the forefront. But I think again, it's just a lot of people don't know what they're giving up.
So actually, that's a good point. And David, I want to kind of come to you for a little bit with your background and kind of the healthcare and the governance and, kind of what we're seeing from whether it's, vaccine, I guess data or, whether it's, HIPAA data, like what are you kind of seeing right now with, are people like taking this more seriously because of, how hot of a topic COVID is to people, like sensitive to that?
In terms of how we're treating sensitive data?
Yeah. Like just like, what are you seeing right now and concerns around like healthcare security?
Sure. So it's interesting because healthcare, as we've talked about, is a little bit behind the curve. Well, not a little bit. It's behind the curve. Okay. It's behind the curve. And it's in part because, healthcare companies weren't built with technology as the driver. That's just the reality of it. So, when, healthcare was paper records and then the technology has to catch up, then that's a paradigm. Right. And so the paradigm that we're trying to shift is to make, technology essentially the point of the spear, right? That helps us to bring healthcare and people and, public health for that matter, as well as clinical health outcomes and improve them. But the reality of it is like, the less you tell your doctor, the less they can do to treat you. Right.
Sure.
But the more you tell your doctor, the more vulnerable that you are to that information potentially being used in ways that are malicious. So we have an interesting kind of paradox in healthcare. And one of the ways that I'll give an example in terms of how that shows up is that we're seeing more and more telehealth visits, right? A couple of years ago, pre-COVID, right? Like the COVID times, I think we should have special robes or something, right? There's the pre-COVID and then there's the COVID and then there's the post-COVID.
Right.
It's almost like but we should have some way of kind of understanding that psychologically, because a couple of years ago, it was hard to get people to do telehealth. Well, I don't want to talk to my physician over the call. Who can overhear me? And am I in a private space? But now that's the norm. And some people don't want to go into the office anymore. But at the same time, to set up a telehealth platform requires a lot more data than we ever used to capture before. And that data is being transmitted across the internet. And how do we do it securely? And then the other part of it is, and I'll close it with this, is there's a lot of competition to determine and develop better telehealth platforms. So we're talking about also RPA coming to the scene, robotic process automation, where now, you're on the telehealth visit, you're communicating to your physician, but you're getting questions and bots are actually picking up the things that you're saying, and it's being captured in notes, as an example, that are going to be available to your physician later. So then how candid should you be in a given visit? So what I can say essentially is that even though we're advancing in the technology, as healthcare as a whole, we don't have all of the technologies and the controls and the policies and the procedures and the implementation guidelines at a level of compliance where we can really extend ourselves that much more into the future. And yet the demand and the command is to do exactly that. So we're not in compliance, right, with some of the frameworks that have been in existence. And yet we have to push the envelope, right, in part because of COVID, to capture more data. And yet, the last piece being is that doesn't mean that we're getting a bigger infusion of dollars to make that happen, or people resources,
Right.
or better technologies. So it's a very interesting thing. Is like, we got to make it to the moon, but you got to have some questions about that rocket.
Right. Now, is that because the ramifications for being incompliant are not high enough? If you're not getting the dollar investment to approve upon these systems, to ingest the data, to analyze the data, is that really because the cost, the fee, the penalty for not being compliant is not high enough? Because we talk about it all the time in the show. Often security is a risk management subject that takes place in the boardroom. And so we always say, if the penalty is not high enough, sometimes organizations will just forego improvement at the cost of their customers' data. Do you see that as being an issue?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, there's certain areas where we're going to definitely have in healthcare more compliance than others. One of them being HIPAA privacy and security rule, right? So most healthcare organizations that are mature enough, they're going to have a higher level of compliance around HIPAA privacy and security. Right. But when you get into access controls, right, when you start to get into physical controls, when you start to get into mobile data platforms, that's where it starts to go a little bit awry, right? Because before FDIC, as an example, you were a good bank if you kept money and you didn't get robbed often, right? But when people really started to lose big dollars, then if you didn't see that FDIC on the building, if you didn't see it right there in writing, right in front of you, you were like, I'm not going in. But at the same time, things like, as an example, high trust certification, which is what we're trying to kind of move towards, is so incredibly comprehensive and demanding, right, for a healthcare organization to get compliant to, that it's kind of like the mountain's too high for us to get there. So let's do these basic things that give us coverage for HIPAA, as an example. But when it comes to some of the other controls, well, we'll get there when we can. And what ends up happening is the argument of it's let's either go after the low hanging fruit, things we know we can do, or let's go where the hammer's coming down. And what happens in between those two extremes is that we are largely in healthcare riding on platforms that are partially secure, some more secure than others. But what we have not really come down to yet is regimenting an industry standard where you have the equivalent of an FDIC, right, on your healthcare door that says to a potential customer, right, whether it's provider or patient, is that I want to now choose a healthcare provider. I want to choose a healthcare organization and a health plan based on how secure they are with my data.
Right. Right.
So we need a bit site credit score situation for people to help make that determination.
Right.
Yep. And then, reputation goes a long way in this industry, honestly. And that's very good insight, by the way. Thank you for that. I think I think that's a good point. I think when you have that kind of large body or standard, it really forces everybody to kind of button up, so they can be a part of the team, so they can have that label. I mean, you see it on other frameworks. You see it in other like FedRAMP, for example, in government compliance, but you're not seeing it the same way in healthcare. And so I guess that stems from more of a systemic legislation type issue.
Well, some of it is that, but when you think about healthcare, right, what you really think about is the bottom line is the quality of care, right? You want to get good care. You want to be hopefully healthy, right? Whether that's going to be clinical and individual or it's going to be population and it's public health. So the driver is really good health, and the face of that driver are the providers, right? But who is actually funding practice offices in terms of getting, their technology up to speed? What you don't hear about yet is Microsoft or Apple or other, or Oracle, big companies that are funding practices, that are funding healthcare organizations and saying, just like they did with Apple Computers and education once upon a time, like, we will help you get secure because there's an interest in that. Right. So who really funds the advancement of the technology and the reduction of risk in healthcare? Because margins for practice offices are getting more and more narrow or slim. And that's if you're not part of a big HMO. So if you're an independent practice today, you're just surviving. Right. And so then how do you put all those dollars into your technology infrastructure? And even for larger organizations that are helping to deliver the healthcare, right, and helping with managed care, again, people are looking at bottom lines. Providers need to get paid, right? The people resources need to get paid. Facilities need to get paid, right? Clinical equipment needs to get paid. So who's actually driving the technology with the dollars, right? Because if we were to invest at the level that we need to as an organization, in most healthcare organizations, then the technology budget would essentially trump many of the other budgets that exist in healthcare. And that's not what healthcare companies are getting paid for.
A very interesting insight. So,
Great
David,
point,
let me ask you, based on your kind of like experience and background, what do you think is like the biggest cyber threat to healthcare like today, right? Is it ransomware? Is it, data leakage? Is it like what do you kind of see out there?
I think those are all kind of effects. Those are all effects. But I think the biggest challenge to healthcare, frankly, is the migration to the cloud. I think that's the biggest challenge, because when you're on-prem, we kind of have, 30 years of experience around what on-prem looks like when you spin up a server. When it went from physical to virtual, there was a level of confusion, right? And then when you're going from virtual to cloud, where you're not even, it's platform as a service or it's infrastructure as a service, right? Now there's even more confusion, and there's this big looming thing called the shared responsibility matrix, where the AWS, right, Microsoft, and Google all have now gained what we talked about, right, which is high trust certification. They all have baselines that are high trust certified for the cloud service offerings. The challenge is when it comes to the shared controls, right, with the healthcare organization and the controls that we specifically have to own. As an example, there's like 500 plus line items for getting into compliance when it comes to the controls that we have to own as a healthcare organization and those that are shared with the CSP, right? So the reality of and the culture, the leadership, the skill set to move from an on-prem reality to the cloud is huge. That alone is the biggest risk. And then once you get to the cloud, the biggest risks are, number one, you didn't complete your shared responsibility matrix. So you're basically relying on the base controls for a cloud service provider, but you haven't looked at the shared, and you don't necessarily have full ownership of the things that you need to do, which includes your information security program and the associated security controls. How will you secure those apps within your tenancy, as an example? And then the other part of that is exfiltration, right? Now that you're in the cloud, what it does is it shifts from essentially an on-prem model to a hub and spoke, where your hub is the cloud. And so that means that you have an inflow and an outflow of data that, one, going to cost you money that you didn't see before. Two, like, you have the potential for something like a mothership to come down and grab the data across all your APIs. And pull that data right out of your cloud. And there's not a whole lot of advanced thinking that we're seeing so far in terms of API security. So really the migration to the cloud, and then the fact that you have the ability to scale, you have the ability to basically share data across tenancies. It's a huge paradigm shift that's not really getting the level of attention that I think it needs for us to secure a better future, a more secure future in the cloud.
Great points. I mean, that's the biggest problem, is people not realizing they still control it.
100%.
Yep. All the access controls, right? Everything, right? That's still.
Yeah, I think also we see that same thing in, regular corporate America too, whether it's healthcare or not. It's the education around the cloud. Like, you brought up a great point. People just kind of magically think cloud is cheaper, and it's like, that's not always the case. I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's not the case. And then my favorite's like, well, the cloud provider provides security. It's like, well, they provide you some tools. If you leave your bucket wide open on the internet, like, that's on you for configuring it wrong, right? They just kind of give you the tools. It's like our favorite thing we talk about here, right? So I think that's a really good insight, right? So it's that continued education around the cloud, understanding the responsibility model, and then, really it changes everything, right? It changes how you do your incident response policies, the tools you use. It like instantly transforms your organization to have all this like really cool tech almost overnight that you may not have, right? And then that means all these new tools that can be also used against you if you don't do things properly and secure things, right? So we see a lot of that, and a lot of conversations we have are around educating people around like cloud security, as we kind of jokingly call it. Like, if I ask 5 people what cloud security is, you get 25 answers, because like it's not like one thing, right? So it makes a lot of sense.
100%. It's like moving into a large condominium that's supposed to be extremely secure. So they've got an external gate, the perimeter's protected. You got to use a pass key to get in the front door, and you're like, I'm good. Well, you're not concerned about your door locks.
Right.
You're not concerned about your ports of entry. You're not concerned about your mailbox where you share a common space with other people. So what are you going to do to secure your tenancy, even within a lockdown, cloud environment? And we also know that if you, for example, S3 containers, you can store data. It doesn't mean that you're doing it securely.
Right. I mean, they could be unauthenticated access containers, right? I mean, they could be publicly accessible. You could have publicly available API keys that get you into all of the different services within your environment. And then what? And so, to your point, I think a lot of it comes down to like you're mentioning, lack of technical knowledge of the environment and understanding what the potential controls are and what the potential threats. And to that end, people look at other examples, and maybe there hasn't been a bad enough example yet to warrant this urgency to fix this. And unfortunately, with the way this industry historically has been, is we've been quite reactionary. We
Yes.
typically wait for the worst possible thing to happen, and then we're like, we really need to make a change. And that's terrible, because we don't want some global cloud level threat to be the thing that finally pushes us or motivates us to actually fix these controls. We want to be proactive about it, but again, I think it's difficult for organizations when they don't have any of the things that we've mentioned: the technical proficiency, the budget, or the foresight to see what the potential threats are. And so, even from a methodology perspective, as an attacker, these methodologies are not quite as built out as, say, your typical network attack or your social engineering attack, which are also evolving, but not quite with the same opportunity that, say, these new cloud-based threats have. And so as those models begin to mature, you're going to see much bigger compromises, with much bigger impact. And hopefully by then we will have some controls in place and we won't be reacting to that.
Well, hopefully 100%. But, as we talked a couple of weeks back, I remember even when I was in graduate school studying public health, and there were two major issues there. One of them was like, the way that we're interacting with each other, just in terms of professors and students, right? Studying public health is not that healthy. We have a lot of toxic environments here. We're not having open conversations. There's a lack of transparency. There's a negative hierarchy that's in place. So, a lot of it is really the culture, the people, the leadership, right? And what's allowed in those kinds of spaces. And then the other part of that is, this concept of zero trust. I could kind of see it back then. I didn't know what it was called. But what I could see is that, like coming from the Army once upon a time, everything about you is authenticated. You know what size pants I'm wearing. You know what size shoes I'm wearing. Before I have to take anything out to the field, you have an inventory right down to a count of ammunition. You know all the things that are going on with me, because there has to be a high level of accountability. Well, a lot of people aren't used to that outside of a military or a law enforcement setting. But when you're going into the cloud, you have to shift your culture, because toxic relationships on-prem are one thing. When you start talking about self-service and infinite scalability, but you're not making good decisions and you're not making balanced decisions and you're not thinking strategically. So now you're overbuilding a system on-prem is one thing. Overbuilding a system in the cloud is completely different, right? And the irony of there, and this is where the zero trust comes in, is that in healthcare, from a provider, from an administrative perspective, with the patient, it's all built around trust. It's all built around trust. But when it comes to the technology that supports healthcare, it needs to be zero trust. And that's a huge paradigm shift.
It is. And zero trust is definitely still an evolving definition. There is no silver bullet that solves it, as we know. So, yeah, definitely look forward to the future with getting that rolled out. I know the government's been pushing a lot of mandates recently to start pushing people towards this. There's some great breakouts that the White House has put out with the 5 or 6 bullet points to start looking at this. So I'm excited for the next couple of years to start seeing this come from that direction, because if the government can do this, there's no reason private enterprise and healthcare and all the other sectors can't start looking at putting this in place either.
100%. And I'm really surprised. And I think one of the things about, your group, your company, is that imagine what it starts to look like when technology leaders start to partner with healthcare organizations that share a similar vision, similar interests, right? Microsoft had a big healthcare platform in the early 2000s, and then it kind of faded away. And it would, even back then, they were talking about being able to do, right, telehealth visits, all these different things as part of the .NET platform, and then it's just kind of faded to gray. So what I would love to be able to see is more technology partners that are choosing almost a healthcare buddy, if you will, right? Where there's some kind of a partnership or alliance that arises where, external innovation and technology development starts to get matched up with organizations that truly need it, and that there's a knowledge sharing that happens that is to the mutual benefit of both, and to include profitability.
Yeah. And is that the reason why that hasn't happened so far? Is simply just profitability? Is that why we're not seeing the big partners that we are or should be?
I think that's a big part of the reason why, because when you think about healthcare, you don't think about your doctor's PC, right?
Mhm.
Unless you go in and see it. You don't think about the fact that they're communicating across networks with other doctors. And if they have a global EHR, right, that your information is going as a data set into a very much, to a larger data set that's being shared across different practitioners, right? And the big hope in terms of going to the electronic health record was in part so that there could be a data sharing opportunity across different providers that are in your world, a 360-degree view of you. But what we've never quite built out yet is, what does that mean in terms of the demands for healthcare? What does that mean in terms of the demand for regulatory agencies and authoritative sources? What does that mean for technology partners that need to be able to help to step into the breach? Because as healthcare, we know that the breach of our information is second only to maybe DoD. And then after that, right, it's finance, or financial data. But the reality is, again, who is helping to push and fund innovation and safe technology development in healthcare? I don't know of any federal grants that are coming through that are saying, like, if you're willing to step up to a higher level of compliance, here's some loans that are available, here's some investors that would be interested, and that essentially healthcare companies would be rewarded for investing in more technology and safer technology, and getting investors that would help to push that envelope. I think a lot of it is because we make assumptions. We just hope healthcare is better, but we don't necessarily want to think more deeply about that. And as investors, potential investors, imagine investing in Blue Cross or Blue Shield or one of the other big plans, because they are at the cusp of driving technology and higher safety and better patient outcomes. But you don't see that as an investment model today.
What's funny is we've been talking about the IT systems a lot of this time. Like, God, I'll think about all the OT systems as well, and the pacemakers and all of those systems within the actual facility that are also vulnerable to compromise. And I think about, like, is it going to take some massive OT attack that really has physical ramifications, real world ramifications, to get people to start taking this seriously?
Oh, 100%. And I'll share one of the, since we're talking about black helicopters, and we're talking about, shiny foil hats. I'll give you one example. And I shared it a long time ago. Pharmaceuticals. Just imagine that what you want to do is identify a population that's vulnerable, as an example. And it's a population that needs insulin. What happens if you not only start hacking generally, but you're hacking pharmaceutical companies and their supply chains to interrupt, right, drug development in such a way that you either take out a key element of what's needed, or you put in something that could be detrimental. And now literally you're talking about taking Tuskegee experiments, right, where
Yep.
there's a whole syphilis thing and some people got placebos, but nobody got really healed. And now you're injecting, right, code, if you will, into the supply chain for pharmaceuticals and taking out specific targeted populations. And when I shared that in a healthcare setting, people looked at me, some were horrified.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They start to
And they
see
were
the real
wondering,
picture. Yeah.
100%. But that's so real. That is so real. And certain populations affect certain ethnic groups as well, right? Certain ethnic groups are more akin to certain disease patterns than others. So there's a lot of things that can happen here on the forefront in terms of terrorism, and that's not just cyber terrorism, that I don't really hear a lot of conversation about yet.
Yep, that's very true. And you don't. It's almost like you're waiting for some politically motivated threat to come around, and it's not unlikely either, because right now I think a lot of the incentive has been financial primarily when you hear about a lot of these attacks. But when you start thinking about political climates like with what's going on with Ukraine, and then you read stories about hacker groups, hacking 436 different healthcare organizations throughout the United States and claiming it as easy. You just start to wonder when these two things are going to cross over. They're already happening in separate spaces. It's like eventually you're gonna see one malicious actor that may honestly try and jump on that opportunity, and then because they will have a lot to gain from it. And so that's that's one of the threats. One of the big
100%.
threats. Yeah.
100%. I mean, hack the medicine and then sell the cure.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Sell the solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good insight there. I think you're right. I mean, we see so many supply chain type attacks, and healthcare is just a prime target. And the Sammy, as you're mentioning, the OT side of things, and some of these OT devices have been around for 20 plus years, running some Windows 2000 probably, or other
Yep.
type legacy systems, and it's just hard to kind of like David, to your point, just like rip and replace these things because there's so much technical debt from the healthcare system. And it's not like this is some brand new technology where it's like ground zero approach, but it's almost like that's kind of almost what you need almost is like this kind of born of the cloud type healthcare provider system that's really kind of thought through a lot of these things and taken that security. And it's almost like the same way that our health premiums are based on like our health and what we do and do we exercise and do you have diabetes, whatever. We should kind of put it back on them. Like, hey, do you guys have cyber hygiene? Do you have IR plans? All these things. And like, well, you don't. Well, guess what? Like you guys get dinged on the backside from, however that kind of all works out. But yeah, it's a whole thing that needs to kind of improve and change, and then just be more aware to what's happening. And I think Sam, to your point, we have seen issues where, I mean, there was a major healthcare provider down here in San Diego that was down for a couple of weeks, and it was a really big deal, like back to pen and paper, not taking appointments type of a thing. And it's a not just monetary impact, but brand reputational and trust damage. So it's not going to go away.
It's funny because the nurses that had been around for a long time, they could go back to paper protocol.
That's
the
right.
newer nurses,
Yeah.
they've never had to do it. They don't know the failover process. So they don't know how to go back to pen and paper.
Yeah,
it's like, what's this thing? It's a pen. I've never seen this before. That's
What
kind
I
of
do.
interesting.
I mean, ultimately, we could go back to
scuba
diving in the middle of the ocean and writing our data on sticky notes to each other. But
Yeah.
Yeah. we do have a lot of data. That would be a lot of sticky notes, though, unfortunately. So I think we'd have a bottleneck. And unfortunately, it's the nature of the game. And I just think that I personally just hope it doesn't take some world breaking event to get us to get up to speed with this stuff. I know. From the healthcare side, hackers are still every day deploying ransomware. And what the crazy thing to me is all these healthcare has all these unique softwares, these unique IoT devices that really have their own set of controls that they require for securing them, and it's just even more so than other industries. And so that's why I think it presents an even bigger problem when it comes to vendor management and all of the different devices and softwares that you bring into your environment. They all require a specialized view of them. How do you secure a pacemaker? What are the controls on a pacemaker, both at a hardware level and at a software level, right? The vendors, the people who are making that, are probably not thinking about cybersecurity first when they're developing this. They're thinking about helping people. And so that I think is one of the issues too, is that gap between the third party vendors and the actual hospitals themselves. And that's right now where I see a lot of hackers taking advantage of. Right.
100%. And that's actually one of the programs that I run, right, is third party assurance. And what I will say also is that the senior most leadership in the organization that I'm working for he's hyper aware of security concerns, hyper aware, because at every strata, right, there's executives that are talking to each other. And if you talk to the executive on the street that just got breached, or to your point in San Diego that you were down for 2 weeks, there's a lot of implications there, but there's a lot of layers between that senior most vision of what could happen and the concerns around that versus, how does that actually get translated into budgeting? How does that actually get translated into staffing? And as we know, right, IT is usually looked at and is, right, a consumer. Like, we take money to function. We don't necessarily produce profit directly, right? We're an enabler, a business enabler, but we're not always a profit maker. We're a budget center, right? And so there's a lot of things that happen in the organization, to include, prioritization around, what's the smallest footprint that IT can actually have to be effective, versus right, what is the magnitude of breach and loss that we can experience if we don't make technology our primary, right, project, primary investment, primary focus. And even down to health plans, when I work with them, there's more and more kind of a collaborative relationship between us responding to them with where we are in terms of compliance and controls and what they're looking for, because there's a flow down, right? There's a flow down there in terms of being a covered entity, right? And that they basically, if we're managing their data, then they're passing down the same requirements that come from federal government or state government down to us, and then we have to pass it down our supply chain. But when's the last time you heard an article talking about the healthcare supply chain and cybersecurity?
Right. Yeah.
Right. And who's funding it? And for that matter, there's no like easy one platform to move on to. We're like, okay, we're going to take the Microsoft Azure, right? We're going to go for the Microsoft Azure healthcare platform. And it has all the things that we would need. Telehealth visits. It uses Teams the right way. It gives us our cloud security. It makes sure that we have all these things in compliance. There's elements of it, but it's not like you can just move in. So the level of architecture and design that has to go into this is not really the wheelhouse of most healthcare organizations or the focus. So now you got to build a secure future for yourself, right, while you keep your day job.
Right.
Yeah, there's not a turnkey solution that just replaces all of it. I mean, there's so many specialties of everything throughout an environment with healthcare that, there's not one interface that does it all, if you will.
Not at all.
You would think that smells like opportunity, doesn't it? Right? You can make
100%.
Sure.
Yeah.
If you have the funding and the regulation and the time to go build that, but not
Well,
going to happen overnight.
Here's the thing that makes it interesting, and the shared responsibility is really a big focus there, right? Especially in terms of the move to the cloud. If you literally look at the shared responsibility matrices for AWS, for Google Cloud, for Azure, the right team of people, remember back when they used to have think tanks, remember those? The right think tank, kind of like what we're doing right here, right now, could literally begin to construct a framework building up from the baseline controls for a CSP all the way up through top-down security architecture and governance, and produce a model even that is cloud service provider agnostic. It's possible to do it, but there's a joining of the minds that has to happen between those of us that are in governance, those of us that are in engineering, in the healthcare space, and those folks that are helping to really drive new innovation in the technology space, and coming together also with regulatory agencies, right, to really understand like what is zero trust for healthcare, as an example. What is zero trust for healthcare? Not just zero trust generally. And that's one of the reasons why, again, I'll emphasize high trust, is that high trust really stands for Health Information Trust Alliance. And it's the only common framework that bridges across multiple authoritative sources to define in one suite all the different areas where you need to be compliant. But when you look at what it takes to get up to compliance for high trust, most organizations balk. They look at the amount of resources, time, commitment, documentation that's going to go into it, and they can never see in a foreseeable future or in a return on investment, why should we go through so much? Why should we invest so much? How can we defer all these other projects that will be displaced and all the dollars that go into it, right, to become this high trust certified organization? And yet more and more health plans are saying, we want you to be high trust certified.
Yeah, there's so much upside to something like that. But like you said, it's a very painful process and not going to happen overnight. But, in the long term, that reward might be, 10, 20, 100x in value if you can look at it from like a business objective and what that can mean to your customer trust and gaining new customers that maybe aren't high trust certified and things like that. So you're right, it's a tricky slope, and sometimes people just see the dollars and cents sometimes of the company and don't kind of can see the value of what these things can really bring. So yeah,
That leads me to think that in the future there likely be these mega provider conglomerates that have the burn rate to be able to actually do this kind of stuff and be compliant, and then they'll be the only ones that can have the deals with the insurance companies, right? I almost feel like that's the case.
That is kind of what it's trending towards, and it's an attrition model, right? Where more and more, like you say, for an individual practice, the likelihood of them being breached is high, right? Because they don't have the resources to really support the infrastructure, the technology, and the people, right, to protect themselves and to prepare in advance. And so organizations that literally, to your point, don't have the funding or the burn rate to be able to stay ahead of the hackers, you're ultimately going to get left behind, because a single breach event can be enough to take out an organization, and that's it. Because your reputational damage can't be recovered. It's almost like if you're a multimillionaire, are you really going to go to a bank that you hope is safe?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. But we promise we're better.
Right.
Yeah. We promise we're better this time. Yeah.
Right. Right. And so do you want yourself, your healthcare data, your children, your spouses, your parents? Do you really want to keep gambling and you really don't have a high level of assurance and, just hoping that it's going to be secure somehow, someday, somewhere, but it's not getting focused on, it's not getting funded. And for those of us that are still trying to speak this vision into being, you either get the Rasputin syndrome where you're floating under bridges and people are like, how can we get that person out of the meeting? Because they keep on bringing us back to this subject. Or you get the John the Baptist and you better get your locust and honey together.
Right.
It's kind of like that saying, like, hope is not a strategy, right? And I think a lot of companies just think like, I hope I don't get hacked, or I hope I don't get breached. And it's like, you can't do that anymore, especially in something as hot as like healthcare is. And like we all know it's a target. I mean, people have come out and said like, yeah, I'm targeting healthcare, and it's a massive impact. And people are so like healthcare sensitive because of COVID and what vaccines and all that kind of good stuff. I don't want to go there, but people are just like hyper aware of this, and now they're just like looking at every little thing, and now they're questioning like, well, what's my healthcare provider know about me, and are they secure and they safe, and how do I get my data? And so yeah, it's a whole wild down the rabbit hole, so to speak. We could spend weeks on probably, right?
Yeah, people don't know they're playing with fire, that's for sure.
100%.
So
Well,
I guess with that,
yeah,
we're kind of wrapping up. David, just real quick, is there any place that our viewers can kind of follow you? Are you on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, or anything?
I am on LinkedIn, so you can definitely follow me there. In terms of Twitter, that's going to be a future effort. And hopefully we'll get a chance to rejoin again on this podcast series, because
Of course,
I don't mind being Rasputin when required. I've done the John the Baptist thing in quite a few deserts, and I don't mind that either, because when it really comes down to it, at the end of the day, right, one of the best ways to take out a nation is take out their health.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the best places to affect GDP. That's one of the best places to impact workforce performance. Without our health, what are we? If we're constantly in a state of recovery like we're seeing in COVID, it affects every aspect of the economy. It affects our relationships. It affects, our state of being, our peace of mind. Health is everything, but we're not funding it accordingly. And I'm not going to stop communicating that message for as long as I'm breathing.
I love it. Well, David, thanks for joining. Take care, everybody. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.
See you
Thank
then.
you, guys.
Take care.
Thanks for joining.
See ya. Thank you.